There's three main styles of photography I personally gravitate towards: landscapes, street travel, and night cityscapes. There's something so exciting to me about the city at night with all the trailing traffic and car lights, the different ways buildings are lit, and the different moods and colors that comes with it. I've been shooting at night on digital for a long time, and ever since I got my first DSLR over 20 years ago, I was curious how to get great shots at night. But ever since I got back into film 5 years ago and into medium format, my love and curiosity with shooting at night was rekindled. So for the past 5-ish years of shooting 35 different film stocks at night, I've had a lot of trial and error with night film photography, and I want to share with you my best tips for getting great exposures. So welcome to my shooting film at night video showing my approach with settings, gear, metering, film stocks, and reciprocity. So I personally get really excited about night photography, and I think by watching this video that you are too. But I think there's probably many who are unsure about shooting at night because it's very high contrast. And things like metering and which film stock to choose and reciprocity might deter some people from trying night photography on film. But I don't think it's any harder than daytime. It just requires some mindset shifts. Now I know there's many videos out there already about night film photography that have great info, but what I wanted to do with this video is I wanted to make this as simple as possible to help you get started while also encouraging you to experiment and try new things. So I'd consider this kind of a mini intro course on shooting film at night. So let's dive in. The first question I got asked was, where do I meter? Now there's usually three main answers. You could meter for the highlights, you could meter for the midtones, or you could meter for the shadows. And I get often asked like which of these three are best. And I don't think that's the right question. I think what you want to consider when shooting film is you should meter based on the look that you are trying to achieve. So by metering for the highlights, you're kind of embracing the darkness. This might be the look you are trying to achieve. I really like the first shot on the left and how you have this front porch with the glowing lights from Cinestill, but it just quickly goes into darkness. You can only make out a little bit of the fence. Same thing for the picture on the right. I love the misty lights from it and just wanted to capture that. I didn't want anything else in the scene to really show up. Or you could kind of meter for the midtones or really find out where you're balancing for the light. So with the Buck's Liquor or this All-American Pool or the Lowry Hill Liquor Store, you want to get as much of the light elements in the scene well balanced. Or another way you can meter is by metering for the shadows or metering for a very dark scene by exposing it and looking at, so on the left side you see typically dark kind of alley, but I wanted it to feel very bright. Or the shot on the right is an example where this is actually the moon, and I basically kind of metered for the shadows or metered to kind of overexpose the scene by 3 to 4 stops on Cinestill, and has this very, almost looks like it's daytime at night. So now I'm going to get into my 4 approaches to shooting film at night. Depending on what camera I want to shoot with, if I'm bringing a tripod or a light meter or going handheld. So whichever one of these I'm picking for the scene is kind of how I'm thinking about how I'm going to approach night. So method number 1, I'm calling it slow and precise. This is where I'm going to be bringing a tripod and cable release. I'm going to use an external light meter like the Sekonic here. I'm going to primarily do spot metering. It's going to be a slower pace, obviously, because you're just using a mechanical, manual camera and manual metering. I'm usually shooting this on medium format, so I've got my Fuji GW690, and I tend to like having a longer shutter speed, and I tend to, especially with this camera, I love how it looks with a hyperfocal look of usually around f11 to f32. Now, for which film speed you can choose, you can basically choose any because you're on a tripod. Next up, I'm calling this the power walk. This is also with a tripod, but using a self-timer rather than a cable release. Primarily using my internal light meter for this. I'm usually doing matrix or center weighted metering. I'm a little bit more medium pace than the slower pace of medium format. It's usually my DSLR 35 millimeter, which is the Nikon N80. And I'm also tend to prefer longer shutter speeds because you can just get better looks from it. The aperture is going to be a little bit different on 35 millimeter. I tend to look at the sharpest end of the lens, and that's usually between 5.6 and maybe f16, f22. And then same thing with the film speed. I can really choose any one that I want. The other advantage of this method is I could either use a prime lens or a zoom lens for this method. Next is the run and gun. So this is handheld, so no tripod. I'm using the internal light meter, matrix or center metering primarily, and this is usually a faster pace. I'm just, walking around, I'm holding the camera, and I'm using my DSLR, which is normally this Nikon N80. And now my shutter speed is usually, I don't like to go much below 1/30th. Every once in a while, I'll play around with 1/15th, but I tend to want to be faster. As well, I'm usually going to do an aperture of, say, f1.8 to f4, kind of depending on how the lighting of the scene is. And, I'm usually bringing a prime lens rather than a zoom lens. And I generally recommend shooting films at 800 speed or higher. Now, last but not least, I'm calling this the quick and dirty. This is handheld once again, using the internal light meter and using, I think the Olympus XA has this center weighted metering, but whatever the metering's on the camera, fastest pace, and it's point and shoot 35 millimeter. Shutter speed is kind of usually around 1/30th or faster. The Olympus gives me a warning, I think if it goes below 1/15th, that it's too slow of a shutter speed, and the aperture is usually around f2.8 or f3.5, and it's also auto. And then again, I have the same recommendation around 800 speeds or higher, and this camera is specifically can only go up to 800. So I'm usually shooting something like Cinestill 800, Portra 800, Lomo 800, or the black and white films that are up to 3200. So now I'll show you a few examples from each method. The first is when I'm bringing my Fuji GW690 medium format film camera. This is by far my favorite method to shoot with because the images that you get out of it are just so good. I often have shot on my GW690, or I've previously owned the GSW690, and you just get these very sharp scenes, beautiful light, and it's my favorite way to shoot. Obviously, it's a little bit more time consuming, but the way the images render is just absolutely beautiful. As you can see, you can try different film stocks. I really liked this shot that came out on gold. And at night, you can get lots of lovely reflections. And as I mentioned before, I really like having the 6x9 negative. You can do hyperfocal distance and really getting very long views. Overall, these are always my favorite images to take at night on this camera. It's definitely, like I said, slower to get to achieve these images, but to me, it's well worth the time it takes to capture these images and meter correctly. I just love all the detail that you get within the lower part of the image with the concrete. And another thing I really enjoy is just trying all these different film stocks to see how they handle each scene. As you can see, the difference between this one and how, same shot at night and how it rendered the contrast of the light. So the power walk approach is a little faster than when I'm shooting on medium format, but I am still bringing a tripod, and I'm usually bringing my Nikon N80, and I'm kind of switching between matrix and center weighted metering, which is on the back. You'll see here, so you can switch between those. And as I mentioned before, I'm often using a zoom lens or a prime lens, but you can go with either since you're using a tripod. So here's a few example of shooting on my Nikon N80 using the power walk method, using a tripod, and kind of switching between matrix and center weighted metering. I will let you know later on kind of how I decide when to choose one or the other. But I really love shooting on this camera as well, especially because it gives me the opportunity to use a zoom lens, and I'll often take a shot and then zoom in a bit more to see how it does in different focal lengths. One thing you'll notice from my channel and from some of my photos, I really like a lot of tungsten film. I've done a lot of different slide films at night and just love how it renders. This is switching back up to Cinestill, and you can see just how different these two shots look. I love both of them. I love the blues and purples from this one, but this one has kind of a more brownish, warmish tone to it. So as you can see, the Nikon N80 is a great way. You just put it on a tripod. I put it on, most of the time I'm in matrix metering, but sometimes in center weighted, and just allowing it to look at the light within the scene. So next is my run and gun approach, which is really just the Nikon N80, but handheld. And I'm usually gonna choose a prime lens. I usually have my 50 1.8 or my 35 f2. So for my run and gun method with my Nikon N80, I'm typically choosing center weighted metering, sometimes matrix metering, but most of the time I'm going to be choosing center weighted. That allows you to get scenes that have a lot more light in kind of the center of the frame. This one could be both center weighted or matrix metering. It'd probably actually come up with the same result, but I think that's a good way to, as you're walking around, choose which metering method you want. And a lot of times I'm either choosing to go with either aperture priority or shutter priority, where I want to make sure I'm not below a certain shutter speed, or just going with like one of the lowest apertures that I can get away with for the scene. So this is one, if I were on a tripod, I would have been able to capture more light, but because I was handheld, this is the shot I got with a lot of, heavy shadows. But I think it looks really cool with all the different neon signs. This is definitely an example where I'm using center weighted. The focus on the scene is mostly in the center, and you got a lot of decent light in the scene here. This is an example I actually am pretty sure I did matrix metering, where you have a decent amount of kind of light throughout the scene. This one definitely more center weighted. But as you're kind of walking around, I sometimes switch between the two just to see what the reading it gives me in camera. But overall, it's pretty good. As you can see, most of the time I'm shooting on 800 ISO films and being able to try to capture as much as I can. In this example, you can actually see it was a bit underexposed. And I actually remember I didn't bring a prime lens. I was using a zoom lens at the widest, the widest aperture I could do at the slowest shutter speed. And it was a little underexposed. So here's where I wish I had had a prime lens with me, because I could have gotten better exposure here. But I think it's really fun too to shoot at night with black and white. You have a lot of very stark contrasts. Here's an example, run and gun. I did matrix metering for this, Lomo 800, and I'll talk about it more later, but kind of that like late golden hour, blue hour is a great time to shoot, because you still get a lot of light and you can handle handheld very well. So my quick and dirty approach is when I take my Olympus XA2 or similar to concerts or like outdoor events, or I just don't want to carry anything heavy. So now I'm going to get into the quick and dirty method, where I'm usually shooting on like my Olympus XA, Olympus XA2, and I've had other point and shoot cameras, but this is just, normally walking around, getting whatever available light there is. This is during a 4th of July celebration, so I'm really focused on getting the best light I can. But, here's an example where it was getting dark fast, and I just had to get, have some of the available light from the taco stand and the blue hour light behind it. Probably my favorite example of using like a point and shoot is I went to the ODESZA concert last year with my Minolta Talker, and I really enjoyed the shots I got from this. But what I was definitely doing in these scenes, it's just a f2.8 lens, 800 ISO with the CineStill 800, and really just shooting it at some of the very brightest scenes. You can see here when it's not that bright, it's underexposed, there's a lot of grain, but I like the effect and the look it gives. But definitely I found that the best shots I took was when the lighting from the stage or from the production was extremely bright at that time. So you can get away with handheld, just knowing that you have to be aware of how bright the light is. And obviously things like, gas stations at Blue Hour, not bad for this point and shoot. And then I think it's really fun for especially the holidays and celebrating different holidays and lighting that you can get. So now I'm going to talk about kind of three main approaches I take when doing metering. The first one I'm going to focus on is doing like manual spot metering. With my Sekonic, I have the L508 and really focusing on getting spot metering for scenes. So I'll give you some kind of tips and advice that I've done when I'm shooting on my Fuji 6x9, shooting medium format, and shooting with the Sekonic. So let's get into the three approaches, starting with manual spot metering. So often when I'm looking at a scene, for example, the Buck Slicker here, I am going to be using my spot meter. And like I said, I'm using this Sekonic L508, and you can use any kind of spot meter. You can use the phone app too, but I definitely recommend having a more dedicated spot meter rather than like an ambient meter or a phone meter. Or sometimes I use just the Nikon N80 spot meter to get some of those readings. So first I might look at what is the aperture that I want. So the meter actually is focused on the shutter speed, but I'm kind of thinking about what's the aperture for the scene that I want as my end result. I'm going to take 2 meter readings typically. So I'm going to usually choose the brightest spot that is not a direct light, like the sign here. So not the brightest section of the scene. It's going to be something like, as you can see, the bright brick right next to the sign. I'm usually looking at that as my first reading. The next spot is going to be the darkest spot, but not like pure dark shadows, because honestly your meter's not even going to pick up on it. So I'm going to try to find where's the darkest spot that's in the shadows that I do want to still be in the scene. And I am going to think about like how many stops of light are in between those 2 readings. What I've seen typically somewhere between, I see a lot of times it's between 4 to 6 stops. 6 is the most I would want it to be, but it's usually around like 3 or 4, 5 stops at the most usually. And most of the time I'm going to average these readings on my meter, and that 90% of the time is going to work for me. Or you could do something like meter the sidewalk in the middle and maybe add a stop depending on how you see, because the way the meter works is it's metering for middle gray in the scene. So the sidewalk here is kind of around middle gray with a little bit of lightness. So if you're not familiar with the zone system, that's kind of what we're doing. That V in the middle is middle gray. So by the way I'm looking at it is I'm wanting to capture what is the brightest part of the scene that isn't pure white or blown out highlights, and what's the darkest part of the scene that is kind of in the shadows but isn't pure darkness that you won't be able to get off of your meter. So to kind of illustrate it again, I am going to kind of show the Sekonic, so I've got kind of a bright area in the scene here. Obviously this is an office, but I'm going to take 2 readings. So I've got one, I've set it to 1 second, and I've got one at f8 and one at f45. I'm going to average them, and that's going to bring me to f16 at 1 second. So, and I've set my ISO. This is at ISO 160 right now. So always make sure that you are setting your ISO before you do it. But that's one way to do it. Again, I'm going to go down up to ISO 800, which is going to be like CineStill or some of these other ones. So taking a meter reading, taking the second meter reading, saving it. It's showing me about 5 stops of light, and I'm doing it in the middle now. And now, because it's ISO 800, I can, as I move up or down, it's showing me both the aperture and the shutter speed. Say I want f16, now I'm at 1/8 of a second to get there. So that's the main thing I'm doing most of the time, especially when I'm trying to kind of average out the scene. Now, if you want to do that, embrace the darkness thing, what I'm typically doing is something like metering for the brightest spot here, like I talked about, like the brick, and just taking that meter reading. That's going to make the sidewalk part will be much darker if I'm just doing that. Otherwise, if I want it to be much brighter, I might be taking just more of the darkest part of the scene and just metering for that. And then it's going to bring kind of the whole scene to be brighter. But the flip side of that, depending on the film that you use, that might blow out some of the highlights too much, especially if you're doing slide film. So again, I think that's the main way that I use the spot metering, especially when I'm shooting on medium format. And maybe in a future video, I can actually go and demonstrate this live, like kind of on scenes, to kind of show you the different metering I do. But let's go on and move on to the next section. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the internal camera metering at night. Now, depending on the camera that you have, now some of these are looking at all the different cameras right now, but some of these are digital. Some of these might be how some of the more modern DSLRs are, but these are kind of the main different ways that you can do metering. So every camera's internal light meter is slightly different, and like the different metering types and options that you have. But this is the main reason why I actually prefer for 35mm using a much more modern camera than, say, like an older camera that tends to only have center weighted or might just only have an average metering, versus like some of the older, like late 90s, early 2000 models have a lot more metering options. So I'm using my camera's internal light meter. I'm usually setting this to matrix or center weighted metering, and I'll go into when I choose one or the other. And then again, I could either set the aperture to what I want, do like aperture priority. If I'm with a tripod, I will probably do f8, f11, all the way up to f32 if it's an option. Handheld, I'm usually doing like f1.8 to f4. Or if I want the shutter speed to what I want, shutter priority, a lot of times with the tripod, I'm probably doing things like 1 second all the way up to 30 seconds, or 1/8 of a second, 1/4 of a second. So fairly slow shutter speeds that definitely you can't get away with doing handheld. Or the other way, if I'm going handheld, I try not to go any slower than 1/30th of a second. With slide film, I'm usually going with that reading of the matrix or center weighted, depending on the look I'm going for. And I don't go over like 1/3 of a stop over it. Slide film, you just have to be a lot more precise in how you shoot it. You're protecting the highlights more on slide film than on color negative film. You can kind of be a little bit more loosey-goosey with color negative film that I found. So again, with color negative film, I might do that matrix metering or center weighted, and I'll either just go with that reading, or I can sometimes do +5 or +0.5 or +1, or the max I'd probably do is +1.5 exposure compensation to give it a little bit more room. Creative effect films, so things like Lomo turquoise, purple, red scale, Metropolis, they have an ISO range, usually like 100 to 400 or 50 to 200, and I'm always setting it on the lowest of those, sometimes even maybe one stop lower than that, because I found if you just go in the middle or on the highest range, it's going to be pretty underexposed. So high level, what I'm tending to do with this method of using my Nikon N80 for either handheld or kind of that run and gun style, I am choosing matrix metering when the scene is like this on the left, where there's kind of a decent amount of light coming from a couple of different angles, versus center weighted is more when there's a lot more light in one section, but more darkness throughout the scene. So another kind of high level example, all of these shots in this were used with matrix metering. You have these pretty decently balanced scenes where there's some light, some dark. Sometimes you have blue hour, sometimes you just have a fairly even amount of light throughout the scene. Even the Halloween Horror Nights one is pretty high contrast, so very dark, very light, but there's a good amount of light in there rather than just it being kind of focused in the center. Versus here's more of the scenes that I'm using something like center weighted metering, where there's more light kind of in the center of the scene and there's a lot more darkness around it. This makes sure that I get some light in the scene, but aren't getting into scenarios where, especially when I'm handheld, it's just too low of a shutter speed for me to shoot it. You do sacrifice a little bit. It's definitely going to be higher contrast, or the shadows are going to be much darker. When you're going handheld and you only have so much shutter speed to be able to handle, this is kind of the way I have to go. So now let's talk about the best film stock. And to be honest, I don't really believe there's a best film stock to shoot. I kind of said at the beginning of this video, I've shot 35 or so different film stocks, and I find ways to kind of love each of them. But I'm going to go through kind of the various different film stocks that I've shot and talk about what I like about them and kind of like what their pros and cons are. And hopefully that will give you some good decisions on which ones to choose when you're going to shoot some night film photography. So my personal favorite is I absolutely love tungsten films. Now, unfortunately, Cinestill 800T, or the film stock it comes from, Kodak Vision 3, is really the only one that's still being made today, but I've shot all these other ones. Fujichrome T64, Fujichrome 64T Type 2, Fuji NPL, Kodak Portra 100T, and I don't have on here, but Kodak Ektachrome has a couple of tungsten films like the 64T and 160T. What I love about them is I think they have the best colors for night, very unique, able to handle all the different lights. And in general, a lot of them have some of the longest reciprocity. So it really allowed me to do longer shutter speeds without having to consider reciprocity times. Color negative is kind of the next one. You have, I would say it's the most forgiving of the films, so it can handle some overexposure. But in general, they do have shorter reciprocity times compared to either tungsten film or as we get into color positive film. So for color positive, we have a couple of things to consider. Is mainly it requires a lot more precision, because there is, if you blow out the highlights too much, then it's not going to look good. But on the flip side, you do typically see much longer reciprocity. I'll go into actual data I've gathered on all the different slide films and their reciprocity times, but in general, color positive does tend to have longer reciprocity times, especially when compared to color negative. Then there's black and white. So black and white tends to be, in general, higher contrast, even depending on the different film stocks you shoot. My experience has been there's not as much gray. It's either pretty black or pretty white. There's not as much gradation in it like there is in the daytime. And then in general, it does have shorter reciprocity, although a few of them here and there do have longer reciprocity times. And last but not least is creative effect films like Metropolis, purple, turquoise, red scale, stuff like that. They give unique looks at night, and I actually have a couple of different videos that focus on those films specifically, but they're definitely fun to shoot. But they have unknown reciprocity times, so it's kind of like learn as you go, experiment to find out how they work. So now I'm going to organize some of those films I just showed you based on some of their reciprocity times, and I think it's pretty cool to see which films really can handle longer times without having to account for reciprocity failure. So the first category here, you see they have a reciprocity time of either 60 seconds or longer. My two favorites by far are T64 and 64T Type 2 from Fujichrome. Acros 102 actually had a very long reciprocity time. To be honest, I haven't shot it that much at night, so I'm actually looking forward to testing that out more. As well as Provia, it has a 2-minute long reciprocity time, so can really handle those longer exposures. Next up is reciprocity that has kind of around 4 to 10 seconds max. You see that Ektachrome E100, Fuji NPL, Portra 100T, and Velvia all kind of have that range. Velvia's max, I think, is 4 seconds, and then you really have to start. It has different reciprocities, and then it actually doesn't recommend beyond a minute long. I think it just has either some strange color shifts or it just doesn't recommend doing it. And then most film stocks, especially a lot of the color negative, some of the black and white, really only has reciprocity up to a second according to the data sheets. But then you kind of have to test out and see what the different reciprocity calculations are for each of these film stocks. And as I mentioned before, all the lomography films really have unknown reciprocity, whether they're the creative effect ones or even just things like Lomo 800, Lomo 400, because they don't publish any of that in like data sheets. So now here I have this kind of data sheet I put together. I've sorted this based on the longest amount of exposure you can do for reciprocity. A couple of things, again, I'm recapping, is slide and tungsten film tend to have longer reciprocity. And 2 surprising film stocks for me was Fujifilm Neopan Acros 100 version 2, as well as Kodak Pro Image 100. In the datasheet says you can go up to 10 seconds. So that's one film I have not shot at night that I now want to try to test out more to see how it handles. Most color negative film stocks, again, have a reciprocity at a second. And most black and white films were also at a second or half a second. Lomo films don't have reciprocity data. Creative films have an ISO range, and I always set it to the lowest or one stop over. So for example, Lomo Purple is 100 to 400. I would set it to 100 or 50 ISO. Now I want to talk a little bit about like my favorite times to shoot or best times to shoot. You know, I think there's different times when it's good to shoot film at night or different challenges or considerations. So I want to go into some of my favorite times to shoot. So first up is Blue Hour. Blue hour is always a great time to shoot. It always looks so lovely. I know this is a little bit not necessarily night, but you can definitely get, you know, the street lights are on, the store lights are on. There's a little bit of light left in the windows and stuff. So I think this is one of my favorite times to shoot kind of at night. You get such lovely light in the sky. You get light on the streets. And a lot of times you can handle most of this handheld. This can be right before sunset or kind of right before sunrise. You get some lovely looks. I love these 2 shots. Velvia 50, kind of right at, you can see a little bit of that orange as the sun is barely left in the horizon. And then this shot on Fujichrome 264 where it was still blue hour, but the sun had already set and just has this lovely deep blue in it. What's great about Blue Hour, you can really get some lovely lights and still a little bit of this blue sky in the background. And one thing I've really liked doing a little bit is I've done some Blue Hour shots on black and white film. I think it has a very lovely look to it. You can see a little bit of the sky, but still kind of the street lights and such. Another one of my favorite times to shoot at night is actually when it's cloudy at night. It just allows like more light in the scene to kind of bounce around and actually lightens the scene quite a bit. So now I'll show you some examples of cloudy night. So I shot 2 films side by side, some of the Reflex Lab 800T, which is really just Kodak Vision 500T, and the Reflex Lab Double X, which is Kodak motion picture film. As you can see, all the clouds add just a lightness to the scene. Here you can see it's quite a bit gray in the black and white film, and it has kind of this greenish look in the color film. Here again, you can see how you see all the lights of the city. There's lots of good shadows here, but just all the cloudiness of the sky just adds kind of a little bit of a reflection. Again, you can see how a very cloudy, misty, hazy night just adds more light overall to the scene and makes it easier to meter. And so the sky or different elements in the scene doesn't seem so stark. It adds more evenness to the image. And to illustrate that, I want to really show kind of a comparison of how a clear night versus a cloudy night looks and kind of how you have to make those considerations. So here you can see how different this scene is on a very cloudy night versus a very beautiful clear night. The dark sky is much darker. There's much more contrast. You might like either of these shots. I like them both. I actually preferred the dark one in this image specifically, but it's all a matter of personal preference and what look you're going for. The one on the left, I would say, is a little bit harder to meter. When you're working with clear nights and city lights, I tend to, especially if it's a shot I want more, I tend to do some more bracketing or make a couple more exposures just to make sure it's the shot that I want. Here's another example, same shot of the Pillsbury flower plant in Minneapolis, and you can really see how stark it is. You can barely make out the building on the left-hand side, but again, I think it can add some drama and make it like a really interesting scene. Here's again the Stone Arch Bridge and how you can see how contrasty it is without the clouds. And this is my favorite example. Obviously, this is a couple weeks apart, so there's a little bit of ice in the clear night scene, but I just like how stark black and white it is versus the clouds on the right-hand side. Just has a lot of black, has a lot of white, but has a good mix of gray in the scene as well. So now this is, I struggle because I like all of these scenes, but rainy nights probably are my favorite. They're definitely the ones you have to be the most careful because you don't want to get your equipment damaged and wet and ruined. But the looks that just like after a nice rain does on film, just it looks so beautiful at night. So here's some of my favorite examples of rainy night photography on film. This is one of the first ones I actually got on film. I love, this is the Fujicolor NPL on the GW. I just love all the reflections here. I even had a little bit of light leaks on top and bottom, but I actually think it adds to the scene. Again, you can see all the different colors. The colors of the red from the sign are now on the street as well. I like this basilica shot with all, you can see all the different colors of light from red to orange to white all throughout this scene. Movie theaters are always a great place to go on a rainy day. And here's an example where there's less light in the scene and just focusing more so on the middle of the scene and its reflection on the street. Another shot of the basilica, but with the Fuji T64 with those bluish looks. We saw this picture earlier, but again, all the rain from that evening just lit up the sidewalk so nicely. I love this shot a lot. It feels like you're in Gotham City. So thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you found this helpful. I hope some of the tips help you think about the different ways to approach night film photography. And please leave me any questions or comments down in the comment section and let me know if you found this helpful, if you have any other tips you would like to share or any other questions. As you probably know from my channel, I love shooting film at night and I plan to make many more videos about film at night. I'll see you on the next one.